As I look back over my reviews of the Ace Attorney games, an increasingly lengthy series of articles that is, at time of writing, nearing its conclusion, with only the two great Ace Attorney games and a crossover with Professor Layton left to talk about, it strikes me that today's subject is probably the one I've been most intrigued by and impatient to get to. The reason for that is straightforward. Not only do I enjoy Ace Attorney's resident gentleman prosecutor, Miles Edgeworth, but it's also a game that only saw an official English translation for the first time a couple of years ago. I've known about the existence of this game for a long time. While I'm not typically one for caring much about patching game files, this is one of the very few games I've thought about trying to find an English language patch for just so I could play it. Thank goodness then that it finally saw the light of localization in 2024 as part of one of the Ace Attorney collections, so I can natter about it now. You're listening to the almighty Backlog. I'm Ellie, and today's review is on Ace Attorney Investigations 2 Prosecutor's Gambit, available for Android, DS, iOS, PC, PlayStation 4, Switch and Xbox One. This review is based on the PS4 release. Originally released in Feb of 2011, developed and published by Capcom. It's an adventure/puzzle game, and How Long to Beat has an average playtime of around 35 hours. The gimmick of the Ace Attorney Investigations spin-off is twofold. First, instead of playing as a defense attorney like Phoenix or Apollo, we are instead controlling Miles Edgeworth. We normally see Miles behind the opposing bench to ours, so it's quite fun to run around in his shoes for once. Secondly, the game tries to be less of a visual novel than the mainline games, and instead embraces a format more akin to a traditional point-and-click, guiding Miles as he awkwardly trots from one place on the screen to the next. It also eschews court sequences, a staple of the mainline games, which feels like a terribly significant change from the norm. There's an argument to be made though that these changes are basically just superficial. For a start, despite presenting itself as more of a conventional adventure game, the amount of text in the game is in reality not especially different to a mainline Ace Attorney title. As is always the case with these games, if you're not able to find joy in a ton of reading, not to mention a certain amount of repetition of text to make sure players really don't miss the information, then this game probably won't be for you. Ace Attorney's trademark, extremely zany character writing is of course still present, with plenty of people in this game showcasing larger-than-life personalities or are entirely focused around a singular character trait. Having said that, I think that Investigations 2 is maybe a little bit more on the ball when it comes to characters that feel more well-rounded than your average Ace Attorney game. It obviously still has some very goofy characters, the prison warden who insists on hugging pets as a model for rehabilitation, or the tiny plump baker whose hair comes to cinnamon swirl points for examples, but quite a lot of the game's cast feels, for want of a better term, relatively understated. Normally in an Ace Attorney title we're inundated with oddballs, but here most of the principal cast are what I would term at best mildly anime. I think part of this perhaps comes down to the presence of Miles and the nature of the crimes he finds himself investigating. He's obviously no stranger to weird and wonderful characters because, he lives in the Ace Attorney universe, but part of his shtick is that he's a reserved and sensible gentleman compared to the exaggerated clowning of Phoenix. Both Investigations games have him focused on a single central case which feels more grounded than the franchise's usual style. Again, that is relatively speaking. Obviously most of the cases in the main games revolve around murder, but here there's a more politically charged narrative as Miles finds himself at the centre of the attempted assassination of a foreign president. From there, the story spirals into a dark, twisting tale of multiple murders and a ton of personal weight and challenge for Miles himself. I think this is, honestly, precisely what the series needed at this point. Across the course of the various games, we've seen Miles at various stages of his life, but the majority of his character writing came way back in the first game, when we were confronted with the DL6 incident and the callous murder of his father Gregory. Since then, when he's shown up, it's often been as an 11th hour ranger dropping in to help Phoenix with some of the franchise's most memorable moments. Despite being named for him, the first Investigations game didn't really focus on him as such, so it's gratifying that the sequel finally puts him front and centre of the narrative. Miles finds his work stymied by an unusual presence in this game, a judge. Typically, the judges in this series have been distant figures. In fact, the only ones I think we've ever got to see prior to this are the main judge in core and his Canadian counterpart. They both cut a very different presence to Judge Gavelle here. There's nothing comic or bumbling about her, instead appearing constantly as a threatening and severe opposition to Miles. There is something vaguely off about her, especially as she always appears alongside the utterly useless rookie prosecutor Eustace Winner, despite his obvious lack of aptitude for the craft, and that tension pervades all of our interactions with her. It makes her one of the series' most frustrating antagonists, but in the best kind of way. Her constant refusal to treat Miles with even an ounce of respect offers a window into the levels of corruption behind the scenes of Ace Attorney's legal system in a way I don't think we've seen since Von Karma's illegal conduct or the arrogant villainy of Police Chief Damon Gant, mocking Wright's inability to take action against him all the way back in the first game. If there's something I think is a bit problematic with the game's narrative, it's that it really does rely on you having already played the prior Ace Attorney games, and not just the first Investigations title. Later games in the franchise are also guilty of this, but Investigations 2 feels particularly self-referential. As returning characters stack up and the plot delves deeper into Miles' past, the chance of anyone picking up on this as an entry point and not being entirely lost reduces drastically. Normally, in Ace Attorney games, they're positioned such that you can more or less follow along even if you're new, with brief recaps of who's who if a character comes back for a cameo, but that's harder to do here because of those who return often do so in significant roles, and the story is already quite densely layered and overlapping, so it's a relatively hard sell for anyone other than a die-hard franchise fan. Of course, if you are a series fan, then you're in for a treat. At its best, Investigations 2 feels like a reward for having stuck with the franchise, as a veritable array of recognisable faces are paraded past and the payoff for Miles' character development finally comes to fruition. Because this game is set in between the two trilogies, the end result for Miles is a foregone conclusion, but it's a testament to the game's writing then that it still manages to feel tense and exciting along the way. The manner in which the finale comes together ranks up there among the best endings in the franchise, which is no small feat given games like Dual Destinies, Ace Attorney and Trials and Tribulations exist. It's perhaps a little overlong for my taste. As usual, the series could benefit from a more judicious editor, but the journey makes the destination worth it. Given that the investigation games don't bother with court sequences, it's funny how much like a traditional Ace Attorney game this winds up feeling. Obviously, the game entirely takes place on-site during Miles' investigations, letting us explore a wide bevy of locations, from a return to Gourd Lake to a murder-stricken movie set. Wait a minute, this is just Ace Attorney 1! I am being facetious, of course, cherry-picking the obvious ones, but it feels notable that this game wants to dive into Miles' past, and it also happens to have so many references to the first game in that way. In fact, it goes even further than that. An early case takes us into a prison where we meet Frank Sorwitt, the very first killer Wright takes down in the entire franchise, and later in that same case also we have the return of the Big Berry Circus, though thankfully in a capacity less dreadful than that case in Justice for All. Anyway, the investigation sequences themselves play out fairly similarly to the regular Ace Attorney ones, and of course much as in the first Investigations game. In essence, players use and point-and-click interface to guide Miles around a scene, interacting with objects and people in order to examine and interview them respectively. Doing so eventually gathers clues, which the game wants you to piece together manually. Each clue is represented as a thought in Miles' brain, and you select two at a time to connect them and draw a conclusion regarding how events transpired. Returning from the first game is The Little Thief, a device handled by Miles' Psychic K, which transposes a recreation of a crime scene's past over wherever you're standing in a sickly green neon design. It's funny that in a franchise that features spirit channeling and Athena's mood matrix in the DS games, that this somehow feels like the most outrageous and unbelievable idea, but there you go. I just find it remarkable that no one ever seriously challenges the validity of it, but hey ho. At points in the game, we get treated to a new mechanic in the form of mind chess. This is part of a broader chess-based theming that this game has, given that the game shows up numerous times as part of cases and there are even characters named for the pieces. Mind chess, then, is a method of interrogation at Miles' disposal used to break the most reticent of witnesses. It's got a nice visual to it with floating chess pieces and a little timer to ramp the pressure up, but it is basically just a riff on the series' normal contradiction-finding gameplay. It does have a little extra bit going on here. Miles has to pick the right prompt or attack to wear away his opponent's mental defences, and to do so requires you to be able to read their body language or tells and know what kind of approach they will respond to. This is at worst somewhat complex, since you can know what is wrong with a testimony but need to find the right way to prove it, but when you're in the groove it can feel very empowering to get the choices right and then mentally throw a bunch of chess pieces at someone. Your investigations eventually come to an end though with some good old-fashioned testimony, and this is why I say that the game's structure without court sequences is really only superficial. While the action might never shift to a court setting, once Miles finds someone to testify about a crime, he enters full-on prosecutor mode, as we're charged with scouring the statements to find contradictions that we can prove by waving evidence in their face. This is, as always, the best bit of any Ace Attorney game, as the battle weaves back and forth and contradictions are highlighted with pointed fingers and cries of objection. As a result, Investigations 2 ends up occupying a kind of happy medium space in between the first game and the mainline series, which I think feels thematically suitable given how tightly the story weaves itself to the plot of some of the core games. It's been a long time since this game initially released, and in the intervening years, Capcom don't seem to have been interested much in revisiting the Investigations setting. I think in some ways that's a shame, because Miles makes for a very interesting character, and we know that this game isn't where his story ends. It's a story that I think could be followed up on, given that we know the Ace Attorney legal system doesn't suddenly get better, as by Apollo Justice, the law has entered its dark age, and the role of attorneys and prosecutors has become muddied and distrusted. Alas, as of right now, we simply have to make do with what we have, and what that is includes this fantastic game. It's not quite broken into my personal top 3 for the series, but it got terribly close. I think if you're a long-term fan of the franchise, you are unlikely to leave this one disappointed. The final score is 6 out of 7. Excellent. Games with a touch of brilliance. It might only just miss out on being a favourite, but you should definitely play this. This has been Ellie on the Almighty Backlog. You can support this project by reading the review over on thealmightybacklog.wordpress.com, or by listening to the pod review hosted wherever you get your podcasts and YouTube. Please feel free to follow me over on Mastodon, Blue Sky and or Backlog by following the links on the blog. If you'd like to support the show financially, you can do so by donating via PayPal to thealmightybacklog@gmail.com or by my Ko-Fi, which you can access by hitting the donate button on the blog. Thank you for listening and have a lovely day.